The US government is about to hand 715 acres of a protected Texas wildlife refuge to SpaceX. The same refuge where SpaceX's rockets have been scattering debris for years. And here is the part that has people angry. Critics say the land is being given away precisely because SpaceX damaged it. The argument runs like this: years of launches and explosions lowered the land's conservation value, and that lower value is now the official reason it can leave public hands. The government tells a very different story. To them, this is a cleanup, a smart trade that actually helps wildlife. So, which is it? Let me walk you through exactly what is happening, what is confirmed, and what is still only an allegation. The details matter here. First, the deal itself, because that headline number is misleading on its own. This is a swap, not a one way gift. SpaceX hands the federal government 683 acres of private land. In return, the US Fish and Wildlife Service gives SpaceX 715 acres carved out of two national wildlife refuges, mostly the Lower Rio Grande Valley Refuge in South Texas. Do the math, and the public ends up 32 acres behind. That sounds small. It is not. According to the conservation groups challenging it, this is one of the largest land exchanges in the history of the National Wildlife Refuge System outside of Alaska. More than 700 acres pulled out of a single refuge. The land SpaceX gives back is not one clean block either. One set of parcels, known informally as Las Palomas, sits surrounded by the lower Rio Grande Valley Refuge. Another set sits near the towns of Laguna Heights and Laguna Vista, next to a second refuge called Laguna Atascosa. The Fish and Wildlife Service says that incoming land is good habitat worth protecting. To understand the fight, you have to understand what this refuge is. Congress created the Lower Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge in 1979. It runs as a corridor along the Rio Grande, a connected ribbon of habitat that wildlife can actually move through. Most of the land the government is now trading away was bought in the 1990s, some of it through condemnation, specifically to protect endangered species and coastal wetlands. And the headline resident is the ocelot, a small, endangered wildcat. This refuge holds some of the best remaining ocelot habitat in the entire United States. It is also home to Aplomado falcons and migratory birds like piping plovers and red knots. That is the point conservationists keep returning to. You cannot carve 715 acres out of the middle of a wildlife corridor without breaking the corridor. Now, SpaceX, it chose the Boca Chica area right next to the refuge as its launch and test site back in 2014, and it has expanded fast ever since. More manufacturing facilities, a second launch pad, and by 2025, the FAA had cleared it to fly up to 25 Starship launches a year, 5 times the old limit. With that scale came mess. Some launches have ended in catastrophic explosions. The conservation groups and reporting on the site describe chunks of concrete and metal thrown more than 6 miles, landing on refuge land, and launch failures sparking wildfires in protected habitat. There is data behind this too. A 2024 study near the launch site found that after a single launch, every monitored shorebird nest suffered egg damage or loss. Everyone. So before we even reach the swap, this is the backdrop. A rocket facility and a wildlife refuge pressed right up against each other, and the refuge taking the hits. Here is where it gets genuinely two sided, and I want to give the government's side its full weight because it is not nonsense. The Fish and Wildlife Service says it started talking with SpaceX about a land exchange back in 2023. The stated goal is that the land around SpaceX has become so industrialized, so broken up by private parcels, so full of noise and light and disturbance that it no longer works well as protected habitat. In the agency's own words, those changes hurt the land's ability to function as part of the regional conservation network. So the logic is this: the refuge land here is already compromised. SpaceX already owns chunks of land mixed right into it, including its Massey test site. Trade away the degraded, fragmented pieces and take in cleaner, better connected habitat next to the other refuge instead. To back this up, the agency ran what it calls biological importance scores. Every parcel got rated on three things, weighted equally: habitat quality, how well it connects to the rest of the refuge, and whether it counts as critical habitat. The refuge land going to SpaceX scored lower than the private land coming in. On that basis, in June, the agency formally concluded the swap would do no significant harm. It even expects SpaceX to use the land for housing, commercial, and manufacturing development. That is the official case, a net conservation benefit. On paper, it is tidy. But that tidy paper case is exactly what the critics attack. And this is where you have to listen closely because their argument is sharp. Their point is about how the land's value got lowered in the first place. In their telling, SpaceX is the one that degraded it. The launches, the explosions, the fires, the debris. And rather than forcing SpaceX to stop or to clean it up, they argue the government simply accepted the damage. Then it used that damage, the lower score, as the reason to hand the land to the company that caused it, break it, lower its value, then receive it. That is the accusation. The Center for Biological Diversity, Save RGV, and the South Texas Environmental Justice Network filed suit to block the deal. Their language is blunt. One advocate called it public land being gifted to the world's richest man. I want to flag clearly that these are the plaintiff's characterizations, not settled fact. SpaceX did not respond to reporters' questions about the exchange, and the Interior Department declined to comment on active litigation. There is also a cultural layer. The Carrizo, Comecrudo Nation of Texas, considers this land sacred and joined the lawsuit. One thing to be precise about: that tribe is not federally recognized, and the government's no significant impact findings specifically refers to sacred sites of federally recognized tribes. So the finding steps around their claim by definition. Two more pieces make this bigger than a local land dispute. The first is a Civil War battlefield. Part of the land going to SpaceX includes sections of the Palmito Ranch battlefield, the site of the last battle of the Civil War, and a National Historic Landmark. Critics warn SpaceX could simply choose not to preserve it. But here the government has an answer worth noting. In May, the Fish and Wildlife Service signed a formal agreement with SpaceX, the Texas Historical Commission, and the National Park Service designed to keep those historic protections in place. So that specific worry has at least a paper safeguard. The second piece is about timing, and this is the most politically charged part, so I am going to stick strictly to what is documented. The deal became public in March 2026, but records obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request show internal planning started as early as April 2025. In those records, the agency talks about building the most expedited schedule possible and hiring extra staff to hit what it called an optimum time frame. That push lines up with the period when Elon Musk was leading the Department of Government Efficiency and publicly threatening to fire federal workers who could not justify their jobs. The records show urgency. They do not, on their own, prove the two things are connected. I will let you sit with that one. So, why should you care about 700 odd acres in South Texas? Because the real question underneath this is precedent. Can a private company move next to protected public land, degrade it through its own operations, and then acquire it on the grounds that it is no longer pristine? If that logic holds, it does not stay in Texas. And there is a counter example sitting right there. In Florida, NASA has launched rockets next to a national wildlife refuge for over 50 years. Coexistence between a space program and protected habitat is possible. That is part of why critics argue this never had to end in a transfer of ownership. The lawsuit itself rests on three federal laws. The conservation groups say the swap violates the National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the National Historic Preservation Act. The government says it followed all three. So, where does this actually stand right now? The land swap is approved. The finding of no significant impact is signed, but it is not final. A federal court in Washington will now decide whether the deal goes through or gets thrown out. 715 acres of public refuge, an endangered cat, a Civil War battlefield, and a question about who protected land is really for. That is what is on the table.